Hello everyone, welcome back to Databricks. In this demo, we are going to build an ADF pipeline to trigger Databricks Notebook with dynamic input parameters which are queried from this SQL server. This config table generation was already covered in other video. Please check that out if you want to learn how to create config tables. So we are going to look up for the SQL configuration values from the SQL server and post lookup. We will set up a pipeline variable operation here. Now this will accept the feed from the lookup and it will set the config load inside this variable. Then the variable output will be passed to the notebook as input, and using this the notebook will parse the input payload and establish a connection with SQL server through JDBC, and it will read the SQL tables dynamically based on the config payload and perform some Spark transformation. So let's get right into the implementation and see how to achieve this. So we are inside the Azure Data Factory. Let's create a pipeline and name it something like Databricks transformation. Alright, so let's do the lookup first to query the config table from our SQL server. So if you are already aware of the config table that we built in our last session, then it is going to look something like this. If you are not sure how we build this, please to check that video out. So we are going to use these two table values, customer table and the customer address table from this config table, and we are going to pass this information as JSON input and set it inside the variable, and that variable output will be passed to Databricks Notebook as input. So that's the end goal of this operation. So let's see how to connect to that. So I'm going to look up the SQL table. So I have already built a data set and I have already built the linked service for this as well. If you want to know how to do that, please to check the previous video. So let's write the query for our operation here. So this expression will give us those responses. So I'm going to click OK and I'm going to debug this to see the response that we get from this lookup. It shouldn't take long and it should be done. Yeah, it is done. So our input is select everything from that table where load flag is 1, and we should see that we got 2 responses. Okay, I haven't disabled the checkbox. I'll remove this first row so that we'll get all the responses from this lookup. Yeah, it's already done. So we can see we have a count of 2 because our table have 2 elements with load flag equal to 1, customer table and customer address table. So let's set this as a pipeline variable, right? So let's do that. Let's create a variable at pipeline level. So if you click on this canvas, you will see pipeline operations. If you click on this lookup, you will see operations specific to lookup. So if I click on the canvas, went to variables, and I'm going to name this as config load, and let's leave it as string. Now let's get this set variable for activity. So I want the output of this lookup to be the input to the set variable. So on success, I'm going to connect these two activities and I'm going to come to this set variable, and in the settings I'm going to use the pipeline variable because our variable is set at the pipeline level. I'm going to select the config load. So this variable will be having the response from our lookup. So I'm going to go to the dynamic content. I'm going to select the lookup activity output dot value. So this will give us the value key, and the whatever value inside the key is there, it will be set to this config load. So if we look at this output, we can see that the value key have this array of both the responses we are interested in. So if we use this value flag, we can pass all of this into this variable. So let's run this now and see what our variable will look like, and it shouldn't take time. It failed. Why did it fail? Says config load of type string cannot be initialized or updated with value of type array. Okay, so our value is of string type, right? Pipeline value. So if we see here, the pipeline variable is of type string. Only parameters have object or other data types. Variables have only 4 data types. So let's make sure that this will not fail. So let's concatenate this into concat the activity. Let's make sure that it has a proper key for us to parse inside the node. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a key, so we will get the complete array element through this output.value, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to add a dictionary kind of a syntax here. So we'll make sure that this will have config key with the colon, and it is going to end with the parenthesis. So this will make sure that we have a dictionary kind of a response from this variable. If I run this again now, we can see the response and we'll understand like what is happening inside this variable. So let's give it a moment. It succeeded now because the string type is already concatenated to string type, and our response will look like this. It will have a config flag, and this config flag will have the array element. Right, we can pass this config load to our Databricks notebook, pass it as an input variable or input parameter to the notebook. So before that, we need two other important elements to pass to the Databricks activity. So if we go to our Databricks workspace, we need the cluster ID, right? If I click on the cluster if I go to compute and click on the cluster that I want to use and click on JSON, I get the cluster ID. So I'm going to copy this cluster ID, go back to our data factory, come to the manage section, click on a new element and give it as cluster ID and pass the value here. And I already have that variable set, so I'm not going to create one more. If I go to the author section again, we can now put the Databricks notebook activity. And if we see the sections that are required, we need the Databricks configuration, and we need the notebook path where we have our notebook placed in our workspace and what are the base parameters that the notebook accepts. So let's create a link service first for our notebook. So to create the link service, I have a link service already. I'm going to show how to create it again. If we click on this new, we'll see the Databricks link service. You can name the link service as per the use case. And if we select the Azure subscription, it will go select the subscription where our workspace is residing. But I want to enter the information manually, the cluster ID, right? I can select new cluster, new job cluster, or existing interactive cluster or existing pool. But if I click on this existing interactive cluster, we can pass the cluster ID dynamically during the ADF runtime. So for that, we have to add a parameter, new parameter here. Let's call this variable as cluster ID. And I'll pass the value to this cluster ID dynamically during the runtime. So if I click on this cluster ID now and click on add dynamic content, I have the cluster ID parameter here. I'm going to select that. This is going to be loaded during the runtime again. So we need the access token to connect to the Databricks workspace. So for that, we can go to our workspace, click on profile, user settings, and if you go to developer section, we will have access tokens. Click on manage and generate a new token. I already have a token, so I'm not going to generate it again. I'm just going to pass it now, and we are going to test the link service connection to the Databricks. So I'm going to pass the token, and let's click on test connection, and this would need, okay, let's get the cluster ID and test the connection for now. Let's go to compute cluster and JSON, get the cluster ID, and let's test this. Okay, and the connection is successful. We can use this link service to connect to the Databricks workspace now. I have already created one, so I'm not going to create again. So let's select the service that I've already created, and this is expecting the cluster ID. Since we already set a cluster ID at the global parameters, let's select that. So let's go to parameters and cluster ID. This is our global parameter. Okay, so this is out of the picture now. We need to pass the notebook. This is the notebook that we are going to invoke through that activity. So this notebook will create a widget, Databricks widget, that will accept the input payload from the data factory, and it will put that input payload into a payload variable inside the notebook. So this section will collect the information from the data factory notebook and pass that config payload into this payload variable. And I have one more notebook I have created, which have simply three variables, username, password, and JDBC URL, to connect to Azure SQL Server from the Databricks notebook. I can do this through the JDBC connection by using Databricks secrets, and I can do everything dynamically, but just for the sake of simplicity, I have created a different notebook and I have created these three variables for isolation, and I'm running that notebook after the widget payload is collected. So this will make sure that we will have three variables by these names with the corresponding secrets, so that we can pass them to our JDBC connection. So I have a method to read data from SQL database. This will take the table name, the JDBC URL, username, and secret of our SQL server from this notebook, and it will pass that information to Spark read, and we are going to read the JDBC, and this function will return the SQL DF dynamically. So this is one thing. This connects to the SQL server and it will read the data for us. So after that, we are taking this payload and loading it as a JSON. And I have created one more dynamic function here which will actually take the payload and it will extract the array element of our configuration from this config load key, and for every element it will take the table name and schema name and add a dot in between those two and make sure that we have a table name that can be queried from our SQL server. And we are appending the values to a list here. After this string operation is completed, we will have a list with the table names like schema.table_name as a list of elements, and with that we will have basically 2 for this specific example. So I'm slicing those 2 elements from that list and passing it into 2 variables. So table 1 and table 2 will give us the names like schema.table_name for the first element of our config, and second element will also have the respective syntax. So with that we are calling this generate condition function and we are capturing the response return from this function into 2 variables. And with those 2 variables we are actually calling our read SQL database function here that we created, and we are passing the table with the JDBC URL, username and password from our other notebook. So during the runtime this will be collected and this will generate 2 data frames, and we are simply performing a simple transformation on these data frames. Like we are taking one data frame and performing an inner join based on the customer ID and segregating males and females from those 2 data frames after the join, and this will give something like this data frame, and this is the end of our transformation. Let's see how our trigger works through the notebook. So in the notebook I'm going to go to the notebook section now, and we have to pass the path of this notebook, right? If I go to the notebook and you can click on this, copy the path, and let's paste the path here. With the path in place we have to pass the base parameters, which is our input payload. So we want the payload to be named as per our notebook, so it should be input payload. So let's go to the notebook. The name of this base parameter should be input payload, and the value should be the response from our set variables config load is our variable. And let's see if this works. Let's try debugging our pipeline now, and the lookup will be done, the variable parameters will be set. So basically this can be done inline inside this notebook directly, so you don't have to do this variable config and all. You can simply come to the settings here, and inside this base parameter you can copy this complete operation that we are doing and pass it inside this notebook as a input inline dynamic content. How to use a set variable activity, I have showcased this in between, but this is actually optional and you can skip this and add this logic inside your notebook base parameters. And this is running. We can see the response by clicking on this details, and I think our cluster is down. The cluster is actually spinning up. If we go to the compute section, we can see that the cluster is starting now. Let's give it a moment and come back and see the response of this operation. Alright, our cluster is running now. Let's go to the data factory and click on this details button. We can see the notebook job URL. So if we click on this, we can see the operation that are currently happening inside the notebook. So if we can see, the job is running, some of the cells are completed, our data frame for SQL Server is successfully loaded, and our data frames are also transformed, and we have 2 data frames, male and female, and these data frames will be displayed as required. You can write this to ADLS or anywhere you want, and our pipeline has also succeeded. That's it everybody. We have successfully triggered a Databricks Notebook from Azure Data Factory and managed to do the transformation using a dynamic input variables from the data factory to the notebook. If this video was useful, please do hit the like button and leave a comment if you want to see how to configure JDBC or any other use case in mind. And I'll be coming back with more interesting and advanced videos on DevOps, MLOps and data engineering. Please do subscribe and don't miss out on the new demos. Thank you for sticking till the end. Have a good day. Bye.